What if the oldest story ever written wasn't meant to entertain us, but to warn us? What if the clay tablets buried beneath the deserts of southern Iraq carry not mythology, but memory? Fragments of something witnessed, survived, and desperately preserved before time could erase it completely. In the dust-choked ruins of ancient Mesopotamia, where the Tigris and Euphrates once cradled the world's first cities, archaeologists uncovered something that still disturbs the neat timeline of human progress. Thousands of clay tablets, each one pressed with wedge-shaped marks by hands dead for 5 millennia, speaking of gods who walked among men, of kings who ruled for impossible lifetimes, and of a flood so catastrophic it divided all of history into 2 eras, the world before and the world after. The Sumerians left us more than pottery shards and crumbling ziggurats. They left us stories, written in their own words, in their own voices, that describe events scholars have spent over a century trying to categorize, dismiss, or explain away. Stories that sound disturbingly familiar. Stories that echo through every corner of our planet, whispered in different languages but carrying the same haunting refrain. The world drowned once, and only a few survived to remember. But here's what makes these particular texts so unsettling. The Sumerians didn't write like people inventing myths. They wrote like people keeping records. Their accounts of the Great Flood include names, measurements, instructions for building survival vessels, and genealogies connecting the pre-flood world to the one that rose from the mud afterward. They documented it the same way they documented grain harvests and tax collections, with the precision of scribes who believed every word mattered, because forgetting might mean losing the last thread connecting them to everything that came before. Before we drift too far into the flooded past, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you're drawn to the kind of history that refuses to stay buried. And if you're still here, listening to these ancient whispers, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and what hour you're keeping. I'd like to imagine this story traveling across time zones, carrying these old voices softly into the night. Tonight, we're going to do something that makes historians uncomfortable. We're going to read the Sumerian flood texts not as mythology, but as testimony. We'll trace the story of Ziusudra, the Sumerian Noah, whose account predates the biblical flood by more than 1,000 years. We'll explore the Eridu Genesis, humanity's oldest written flood narrative, and ask the questions that conventional archaeology prefers to avoid. What if these weren't symbolic tales about divine judgment? What if they were survival accounts passed down by people who watched their entire world vanish beneath rising waters? We'll examine the archaeological evidence. Layers of flood, sediment found in the ruins of Uruk, and other Sumerian cities, deposits that speak of catastrophic inundation. We'll follow the thread of flood myths that appears in every ancient culture, from Mesopotamia to Mesoamerica, from India to Greece, all describing the same cataclysm with eerie consistency. And we'll venture into the most provocative question of all. What knowledge did the antediluvian world possess that the Sumerians fought so desperately to preserve? This isn't about certainty, it's about curiosity, about reading old texts with fresh eyes and asking what truths might be hiding in the spaces between myth and history, between legend and lived experience. The clay tablets are waiting, and they have stories to tell that might change everything we thought we knew about our own beginning. Between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, in what is now southern Iraq, something impossible happened. Around 4,500 BCE, in a region archaeologists call Sumer, human civilization didn't gradually emerge through slow centuries of development. It exploded into existence already refined, already sophisticated, already literate. Cities rose from the alluvial plain with monumental architecture, irrigation systems spanning hundreds of miles, legal codes governing commerce and justice, and a writing system capable of recording everything from grain inventories to the structure of the cosmos. This was not supposed to happen. According to every model of cultural evolution, societies move incrementally from hunter-gatherers to settled farmers, from oral tradition to pictographs, from simple to complex over millennia of trial and error. But Sumer skipped the intermediary steps. The archaeological record shows a sudden flowering of urban life, as though someone had planted the seeds of civilization fully formed and watched them bloom in a single generation. The Sumerians gave us the wheel, the plough, the sailboat, bronze metallurgy, the concept of time divided into 60-second minutes and 60-minute hours, a mathematical system based on the number 60 that we still use today. They created the first schools, the first pharmacopoeia, the first legal precedents, the first literary works. They mapped the night sky with precision that would not be matched for 3,000 years, and they wrote it all down. The writing itself is the mystery within the mystery. Cuneiform, the wedge-shaped script pressed into wet clay with a reed stylus, appears in the archaeological record around 3,500 BCE, already developed enough to record complex administrative documents, religious hymns, and economic transactions. There are no primitive versions, no crude early attempts. The earliest tablets show a system already capable of extraordinary nuance, a script that could capture not just inventory lists, but philosophy, astronomy, mythology, and law. It was as though the Sumerians had not invented writing, but remembered it, recovered it, from some earlier template now lost to time. And what they chose to write was telling. Yes, they recorded grain shipments and tax receipts, the mundane necessities of urban life. But they also recorded something else, something they considered even more important: memory. The tablets are filled with phrases like, "in those days," "in those distant days," and "when heaven and earth were separated," and "before the flood." The Sumerians were obsessed with preserving the past, with ensuring that what had come before would not be forgotten. They saw themselves not as innovators, but as custodians, keepers of knowledge that predated their cities, their culture, perhaps even their species. And that knowledge was extraordinary. Among the thousands of cuneiform tablets recovered from Sumerian sites, archaeologists found astronomical texts calculating the synodic periods of planets with stunning accuracy. One tablet records the orbital period of Venus as 584 days, a figure that requires generations of continuous observation and sophisticated mathematics to derive. The Greeks wouldn't achieve this level of precision for another 2 millennia. European astronomers wouldn't confirm it until the Renaissance. Yet there it was, pressed into clay, matter of fact, as though copying from an older source that everyone simply accepted as true. Other tablets track the movements of Jupiter, Saturn, Mercury, and Mars. They record lunar eclipses in 18-year cycles known as the Saros cycle, a pattern that requires not just observation, but predictive modelling. They describe the precession of the equinoxes, the slow wobble of Earth's axis that takes 25,920 years to complete a full cycle. To observe precession, you need multi-generational data spanning centuries, passed down with meticulous care, preserved against loss and corruption. How could the first civilization already possess this knowledge unless they were not the first? Unless they were inheriting records from something older, something that had come before and been nearly destroyed. The mathematics embedded in Sumerian texts tells the same strange story. Tablets from the Old Babylonian period, successors to Sumerian culture, contain trigonometric tables, calculations of square roots using iterative methods, nearly identical to modern algorithms, and geometric progressions that wouldn't resurface in Western mathematics until medieval Arab scholars rediscovered them. The famous Plimpton 322 tablet contains Pythagorean triples, sets of numbers satisfying the equation A2 plus B2, C2, more than 1,000 years before Pythagoras was born. The tablet doesn't explain the theorem. It applies it, uses it as a tool so familiar that no instruction is needed. The knowledge was already embedded, already assumed, inherited from a source the scribes felt no need to cite. But it is not the scientific knowledge alone that haunts us. It is what the Sumerians wrote about their own origins. Among the most important texts preserved on clay are three that speak directly of the world before the flood: the Eridu Genesis, the Sumerian King List, and the Atrahasis Epic. Each one describes a time of great cities, advanced civilization, and direct contact between humans and gods, a golden age that ended abruptly in cataclysm. The Eridu Genesis, named after Sumer's oldest city, tells of the creation of humanity, the founding of the first cities, and the decision by the gods to destroy the world with a deluge. The text is fragmentary, pieces missing, but what remains is chilling in its specificity. It names the cities that existed before the flood: Eridu, Bad Tibera, Larak, Sippar, and Shuruppak. It describes a king named Ziusudra, who was warned by the god Enki to build a great boat and preserve the seed of all living things. After 7 days and 7 nights of flood, Ziusudra emerges, offers sacrifice, and is granted immortality by the gods. The gods themselves weep at what they have done, lamenting the destruction of a world they now realize should have been saved. This is not myth in the casual sense. This is historical record encoded in religious language. The Sumerians believed these cities had existed. They believed Ziusudra was real, and they believed the flood was a historical event that had reset civilization, forcing humanity to begin again from fragments. The Sumerian King List reinforces this belief in the most unsettling way possible. This text, found on multiple tablets across different sites, claims to record every king who ruled in Sumer from the beginning of time until the scribe's present day. It begins with the line, "When kingship was lowered from heaven, kingship was in Eridu," and then it lists the rulers who reigned before the flood, along with the lengths of their reigns. Alulim ruled for 28,800 years. Alagar ruled for 36,000 years. Enmenluana ruled for 43,200 years. 8 kings in total, spanning a combined 241,200 years. Mainstream scholarship dismisses these numbers as mythological, symbolic, perhaps representing dynasties rather than individuals, or encoding some numerological code now lost to interpretation. But the Sumerian scribes did not treat them as symbolic. After listing the antediluvian kings, the text simply states, "Then the flood swept over." And then it resumes with a new list of kings, post-flood rulers with much shorter reigns measured in decades and centuries, not millennia. The transition is abrupt, but matter of fact. The flood was a boundary, a dividing line in history. Before it, the world was different. After it, humanity had to rebuild. What makes the king list so compelling is not the impossible reign lengths, but the structure. The scribes who compiled it were meticulous bureaucrats. They cross-referenced sources, noted discrepancies, and adjusted their lists based on new archaeological discoveries of older inscriptions. They took their work seriously. To them, this was not storytelling. This was history. And if the antediluvian section contained exaggerated numbers, perhaps that was because the records themselves were fragmentary, corrupted by time, copied and recopied from tablets so ancient that even the Sumerians considered them relics of a lost age. The Atrahasis epic, another flood narrative preserved in both Sumerian and later Akkadian versions, adds a disturbing layer to the story. It describes humanity's creation by the Anunnaki, a race of beings who came from the heavens to earth and grew weary of laboring to extract resources from the planet. To ease their burden, they created humans by mixing the blood of a slain god with clay, engineering a worker species capable of agriculture, mining, and construction. For a time, this arrangement worked. Humanity multiplied, cities flourished, and the Anunnaki oversaw civilization from their temples. But humans became too numerous, too noisy, too disruptive. The god Enlil, ruler of the Anunnaki Council, decided to eliminate them through a great flood. Enki, god of wisdom and water, opposed this decision and secretly warned the human king Atrahasis to build a boat and save his family, along with animals and craftsmen, the seeds of civilization. The flood came. The world drowned. And when the waters receded, the surviving gods looked upon the empty earth and wept, realizing that without humanity, they had no one to sustain them, no one to maintain the temples, no one to remember their names. This is the consistent theme running through all Sumerian flood narratives. The flood was not divine punishment in the biblical sense. It was a mistake, a decision regretted, a cataclysm that nearly erased both humanity and the knowledge humanity had been given. The gods needed humanity as much as humanity needed the gods. And what emerged from the flood was a covenant, an understanding that the knowledge must be preserved at all costs, written down, encoded in durable materials, passed from generation to generation, so that it would never be lost again. The Sumerians took this task seriously. They built libraries, vast repositories of clay tablets, stored in specially designed rooms within temple complexes. The library at Nippur, Sumer's religious capital, contained tens of thousands of tablets covering every subject imaginable: hymns, myths, medical texts, mathematical tables, astronomical observations, legal contracts, and school exercises where students copied ancient texts as part of their training. The scribes were not merely recording their own culture, they were preserving something older, translating and copying texts, written in archaic forms of Sumerian that even they struggled to fully understand. And they were not alone in this obsession. Across the ancient world, separated by vast distances and supposed cultural isolation, other civilizations told the same story. The Akkadians inherited the Sumerian flood myth and adapted it into the Epic of Gilgamesh, where the immortal Utnapishtim describes surviving the deluge in terms almost identical to the Sumerian accounts. The Babylonians preserved it. The Assyrians copied it into their royal libraries. And far beyond Mesopotamia, cultures that supposedly had no contact with Sumer told the same tale. A great flood, a chosen survivor, a boat filled with life, and the re-emergence of civilization from the remnants of a drowned world. How could such consistency emerge independently? How could the details align so precisely across cultures, separated by oceans and millennia, unless the memory itself was older than any single civilization, unless the flood was not myth but history, and the story had been carried by survivors to distant shores where it was preserved, adapted, and passed down through oral tradition until writing finally captured it again. The Sumerians believed they were recording real events. They believed the antediluvian world had existed, that the cities listed in the Eridu Genesis were once real places, now buried beneath silt and time. They believed the Anunnaki had walked among them, taught them, and then withdrawn, leaving humanity with the sacred task of preservation. Whether these beliefs were literal truth, cultural memory distorted by time, or something in between, the Sumerians acted as though the knowledge they possessed was not theirs by right of discovery, but by inheritance from a world that had come before and been destroyed. And so they wrote. They pressed wedges into wet clay, recording everything they could, creating humanity's first written library, the foundation upon which all later civilizations would build. They gave us the oldest written stories, the oldest star charts, the oldest legal codes, the oldest school textbooks. They gave us the first written word for freedom, amagi, which literally means return to the mother. And they gave us the oldest flood narrative, a story they did not invent but claim to remember, a warning from the distant past that knowledge is fragile, that civilization can be erased in a single catastrophic event, and that our only defense against oblivion is to write it down, preserve it, and never let it be forgotten again. The question that haunts every cuneiform tablet pulled from the ruins of Ur and Uruk and Eridu is this: what were they trying so desperately to remember, and what were they afraid we might forget? But before we can understand what the flood destroyed, we must first understand the story of the flood itself. Not the version you learned in Sunday school, not the tale of Noah and his ark passed down through Genesis. We must go back further, 1,000 years further, to a fragment of clay pulled from the ruins of Nippur in 1893, catalogued, translated, and quietly filed away, because what it contained was so similar to the biblical account that it threatened to rewrite everything scholars thought they knew about the origins of Western religion. The tablet is called the Eridu Genesis, named after Eridu, the oldest city in Sumerian records, the place where, according to myth, kingship first descended from heaven. The tablet itself is broken, incomplete. Large sections are missing, dissolved back into dust or carried off by looters millennia ago. But what remains is enough. Enough to confirm that the story of a great flood, a chosen survivor, and the near annihilation of humanity was not invented by Hebrew scribes. It was inherited, copied, translated from an older source that stretches back into a time we can barely fathom. The Eridu Genesis dates to approximately 2300 BCE, though the story it records is certainly older, passed down orally for generations, before anyone thought to press it into clay. By comparison, the earliest biblical accounts of Noah's flood were written around 1000 BCE at the earliest, during the reign of King Solomon, perhaps later during the Babylonian exile. Over 1,000 years separate these texts, and yet the structure is nearly identical. A divine warning, a righteous man chosen to survive, a vessel built to specific dimensions, animals saved in pairs, waters that cover the earth, a bird sent out to search for dry land, and finally, a sacrifice offered to gods who regret what they have done. The parallels are undeniable, but the differences, subtle and strange, may be even more important. The Genesis begins not with the flood, but with creation itself. In the beginning, according to the tablets, there were no cities, no agriculture, no temples. Humanity did not yet exist. The earth was wild, unordered, and the gods, the Anunnaki, walked upon it seeking something: labor. The tablets describe a problem. The work of managing the earth, digging canals, planting fields, maintaining the cosmic order, was exhausting. The younger gods, the Igigi, were tasked with this labor, and they grew resentful. They toiled endlessly, while the elder gods rested in their temples. And so, according to the text, the Anunnaki made a decision. They would create a new species, a worker race designed specifically to serve them, to carry the burden of maintaining the world so the gods would no longer need to. The god Enki, lord of the Abzu, the deep waters beneath the earth, master of wisdom and creation, took clay from the primordial waters and shaped it into the first humans. But the creation was not an act of love. It was an act of utility. Humanity in the Sumerian worldview was not made in the image of the divine. We were made to serve the divine. We were tools, gifted with intelligence and language, so we could follow instructions, blessed with reproduction, so we could multiply and sustain the workforce across generations. The gods did not create us for companionship. They created us so they could rest. And for a time, it worked. Humanity multiplied. Cities rose. Fields were planted. Canals were dug. The temples filled with offerings and the gods were pleased. But then something went wrong. The tablets are fragmented here, maddeningly incomplete, but the essence is clear. Humanity became too successful. We multiplied too quickly, spread too far, grew too loud. The text records that the noise of humanity rose up to the heavens, disturbing the sleep of the gods. Enlil, the chief deity, king of the gods and lord of the storm, could no longer rest. The clamour of human civilization, our cities, our festivals, our constant activity, became unbearable. And so Enlil made a decision. Humanity would be destroyed. Some scholars read this as metaphor: overpopulation straining resources, environmental collapse, the natural consequence of unchecked expansion. But the text does not describe resource depletion. It describes divine irritation. The gods were disturbed, not threatened, not endangered, simply annoyed. And for that, the entire species was to be erased. Unless, of course, there was something else, something the tablets hint at, but never fully explain. Were the gods truly angry about noise? Or had humanity done something else? Had we learned too much, grown too independent, begun to question our role as servants? The text is silent on this, but it is a silence that echoes. Because in other Sumerian myths, humanity's crime is not noise, it is knowledge. It is the theft of the Me, the divine codes of civilization. It is the crossing of boundaries that were meant to remain fixed. Whatever the reason, Enlil's decision was final. He would send a flood, not a seasonal inundation, not a river overflowing its banks, but a deluge that would cover the earth, drown the cities, and sweep humanity back into the clay from which we came. The other gods agreed, or most of them did. But one did not. Enki, the god who had shaped humanity from the deep waters, who had given us language and thought, refused to let his creation be destroyed. He could not defy Enlil openly. To do so would be to fracture the divine order, to risk cosmic chaos. But he could act in secret. And so he did. The Genesis describes Enki's rebellion in language that is quiet, almost conspiratorial. He did not appear to his chosen survivor directly. Instead, he spoke through a wall. The text records this strange detail with no elaboration, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. Enki went to the home of Ziusudra, a king of Shuruppak, a city that once stood along the Euphrates, and he spoke to the wall of Ziusudra's house, warning him of what was to come. "The flood is coming," the voice said. "Build a boat. Seal it with bitumen. Load it with the seed of all living things. Save yourself. Save your family. Save what can be saved. Why a wall? Why not appear directly?" Some scholars suggest it was a legal loophole, a way for Enki to claim he had not technically violated Enlil's decree. He did not warn a human. He spoke to a structure. What the human overheard was not his responsibility. Others interpret it more literally. Perhaps Enki could not manifest fully in the physical world. Or perhaps speaking through a wall was a way of concealing his presence from the other gods. Or perhaps, stranger still, the wall itself was some kind of device, a medium through which divine communication could be transmitted without direct contact. The text does not explain, it simply records. Enki spoke to the wall, and Ziusudra, listening, understood. The instructions were precise. The vessel was to be enormous, though the exact dimensions are lost to damage on the tablet. It was to be sealed completely, watertight, coated inside and out with bitumen, the thick black tar that bubbled up from the earth in ancient Mesopotamia. Ziusudra was to bring his family, the animals, the seed of every plant, and enough provisions to survive an unknown duration. He was not told how long the flood would last, only that it would come, and that when it did, nothing outside the vessel would survive. And then, the tablets say, the flood arrived, not gradually, not with warning rains or rising rivers. It came all at once. The text describes it in language that borders on cosmic violence. The storm god Adad roared in the clouds. The dikes of heaven were opened. The fountains of the deep burst forth. Water poured from above and below simultaneously, as though the boundary between sky and ocean had dissolved. The ancient world, the cities, the fields, the temples, everything humanity had built was swallowed. The tablet records that even the gods were terrified. They fled to the highest heaven and cowered there like dogs, trembling as they watched the world drown. It is a startling image. The gods, afraid, not in control, not orchestrating the disaster with calm detachment, but panicking, realizing perhaps too late that the destruction they had unleashed was too great, too absolute. Some fragments suggest that the goddess Inanna wept, lamenting the loss of her people. Others hint that even Enlil, watching the floodwaters rise, began to regret his decision. But it was too late. The waters were already rising, and there was nothing the gods could do but watch. The flood lasted, according to the fragments that survive, 7 days and 7 nights. A week of unrelenting deluge. When it finally stopped, when the waters began to recede, the world was unrecognizable. The cities were gone, the temples were buried, the fields were covered in thick layers of silt. Ziusudra opened the hatch of his vessel and looked out onto a drowned earth. The tablet describes him releasing a bird, though the type is unclear in the damaged text, perhaps a dove, perhaps a raven. The bird flew out, searching for dry land, and returned. He waited. He released another. This time, it did not return. Land had emerged somewhere. Life could begin again. Ziusudra brought his vessel to rest on a mountain. The text does not name it, though later Mesopotamian versions call it Mount Nisia, a peak in the Zagros range. He disembarked, built an altar, and offered a sacrifice. The smell of burning meat rose into the air, and the gods who had been starving, who had lost their human servants, and the offerings they provided, descended eagerly. The tablet describes them gathering around the sacrifice like flies, desperate, humbled. Enlil arrived last, and when he saw Ziusudra alive, standing beside his family and the animals he had saved, Enlil's rage ignited again. Someone had defied him. Someone had warned the human. But Enki stepped forward. He confessed, or perhaps he boasted. The text is ambiguous. He did not apologize. Instead, he argued, was it right to destroy the righteous along with the wicked? Was it just to annihilate an entire species for the crime of being loud? Could the gods not have found another way? A plague, perhaps. A famine. Something targeted. Something measured. Why total destruction? And Enlil, confronted with his own cruelty, listening to the logic of Enki, relented. Not entirely, not with grace, but enough. He agreed that humanity could survive. But things would change. Humans would no longer live as long. Disease, famine, wild animals. These would keep the population in check. Mortality would be increased. Suffering would be woven into existence. But extinction would be avoided. Ziusudra was blessed. He and his wife were granted immortality and taken to Dilmun, the Sumerian paradise, a distant land where the sun rises, where there is no sickness, no death, no sorrow. They would live there forever, removed from the world they had saved, honored but isolated, remembered but unreachable. And humanity, descending from Ziusudra's children, began again. The parallels to the biblical flood are obvious. The structure is nearly identical. A righteous man, a divine warning, a vessel, animals, a bird, a mountain, a sacrifice, a covenant. But the differences reveal something deeper, something about how these stories were understood. In Genesis, Noah is saved because he is righteous in the eyes of God. The flood is a moral reckoning, a cleansing of sin, a reset driven by divine justice. But in the Eridu Genesis, Ziusudra is not saved because he is righteous. He is saved because Enki chose him. The flood is not justice, it is annoyance. Humanity's crime is not sin, it is noise. The gods are not moral arbiters. They are powerful, capricious, and flawed. They panic, they regret, they hunger. They argue among themselves. They are not omniscient or omnipotent. They are limited, bound by their own natures, trapped in a cosmic hierarchy they cannot escape. This is not the monotheistic God of Abraham. This is something older, something stranger. A pantheon of beings who created humanity not out of love, but necessity, who nearly destroyed us not out of wrath, but irritation, and who saved a remnant not out of mercy, but because one among them rebelled and refused to let his creation die. It is a vision of divinity that is profoundly alien to modern religious thought. And yet, it is the older version, the original, the story from which all the others descended. And the question remains, haunting every wedge-shaped mark on that broken tablet. Was this myth? Or was it memory? Did the Sumerians invent this story to explain the silt layers beneath their cities? Or were they recording something that actually happened, preserving a testimony passed down from survivors who had lived through a cataclysm so vast that it felt like the end of the world? Because here is the uncomfortable truth. The flood in the Eridu Genesis is not described like myth. It is described like reportage. The details are specific. The geography is real. The timeline is measurable. 7 days and nights, a mountain in the Zagros range, a vessel coated with bitumen. These are not the embellishments of fantasy. They are the annotations of memory. And when archaeologists began digging beneath the cities of ancient Sumer, they found something that should not have been there. Layers of clay, thick, sterile, sedimentary deposits separating older occupation layers from newer ones. Flood layers. Physical evidence that at some point in the deep past, the cities of Mesopotamia had been drowned, not once, but multiple times, as though the earth itself were confirming what the tablets had been saying all along. The flood was real. It happened, and someone survived to tell the story. But what was lost beneath those waters? What kind of world existed before the deluge? And if the flood truly happened, if Ziusudra and his vessel truly existed, then what else in these ancient texts might be true? The Sumerian king list does not begin with history as we understand it. It begins with impossibility. Before the flood, the tablets tell us, there were cities, not primitive settlements, not mud brick villages clinging to riverbanks, but organized urban centers with temples, palaces, and administrative systems. 7 cities in total: Eridu, Bad Tibera, Larak, Sippar, and Shuruppak. Each one ruled by kings whose reign stretched not for decades, but for millennia. Alulim, the first king of Eridu, ruled for 28,800 years. His successor, Algar, for 36,000 years. Enmenluana of Bad Tibera reigned for 43,200 years. The numbers continue, absurd and precise, until the flood sweeps everything away. 8 kings. 10 kings, depending on which version of the list you read. Together, they governed for a combined total of over 240,000 years. Mainstream scholars dismiss these figures as mythological inflation. The lengths of reign, they argue, are symbolic, reflecting the sacred importance of these antediluvian rulers, not their actual lifespan. Perhaps the numbers represent dynasties rather than individuals. Perhaps they are metaphors for ages of stability or divine favor. Perhaps they are simply fantasy. And yet the Sumerians did not treat these numbers as fantasy. They copied them meticulously, generation after generation, preserving the exact figures across multiple versions of the king list. They maintained separate records for antediluvian and post-diluvian rulers, as though acknowledging a clear dividing line in history. Before the flood, time functioned differently, humanity functioned differently, and the world itself was something other than what came after. So what kind of world was it? According to the fragments that survive, the antediluvian world was not primitive. It was advanced, organized, governed by principles that would later be lost and only slowly recovered. The texts describe agriculture that was not subsistence farming, but systematized cultivation. Grain was measured, recorded, distributed through temple complexes that functioned as both religious centers and administrative hubs. Irrigation canals, those lifelines of Mesopotamian civilization, already existed. The knowledge of how to divert rivers, control flooding, and channel water across arid plains was already in place, not developing, already operational. Metalwork too appears in the pre-Diluvian world. Bronze is mentioned, tools and weapons forged with an understanding of alloy ratios that should not exist yet. Architecture rises in monumental form. Temples constructed with geometric precision, their foundations aligned to celestial events. The Sumerians did not describe their ancestors as learning these skills. They described them as possessing them, as though the knowledge had been delivered complete, fully formed, from a source the texts name again and again, the Anunnaki, those who from heaven to earth came. The phrase appears so often in Sumerian literature that it becomes almost liturgical. A refrain woven through creation myths, king lists, temple hymns, and legal codes. The Anunnaki were not distant abstractions. They were active participants in the world before the flood. They walked among humans. They taught, commanded, built, and ruled. And according to the tablets, they were the reason humanity existed at all. The creation of humanity, as described in texts like the Atrahasis epic and the Enuma Elish, was not an act of love. It was an act of necessity. The Anunnaki, laboring in the depths of the earth to mine precious minerals and maintain the infrastructure of their world, grew weary. The work was endless, the conditions unbearable, and so they rebelled. The younger gods, the Igigi, cast down their tools and refused to continue. Enlil, the chief of the Anunnaki Council, was prepared to destroy them. But Enki, ever the clever one, proposed an alternative. Create a new being, a creature capable of labor, intelligent enough to follow commands, but limited enough to remain subservient. A worker, a servant, humanity. The method described in the texts is disturbingly precise. Enki and the birth goddess Nintu, also called Ninhursag, take clay from the Abzu, the primordial waters beneath the earth. But clay alone is not enough. They mix it with the blood of a slain god, Wei-Ila, a deity sacrificed specifically for this purpose. His divine essence, his me, is blended with earthly matter. The result is Adamu. Not Adam in the biblical sense, though the linguistic echo is unavoidable. Adamu means one of earth or one made from clay. The first human, the prototype. And once the design proves successful, Nintu creates more. 7 males, 7 females. The templates from which all humanity descends. This was not a gift. It was engineering. Humanity, according to the Sumerians, was designed. We were not born from divine love or cosmic accident. We were manufactured to serve, to carry the burdens the Anunnaki no longer wished to bear. Our purpose was labor. Our value was utility. And yet, within that grim origin, something unexpected emerged. Consciousness, language, creativity. The ability not just to obey, but to remember, to question, to preserve. Perhaps that is why the texts also describe something else. Something the Anunnaki had not planned for. The mixing of bloodlines. In fragmentary tablets and passing references, the Sumerian records hint at unions between the Anunnaki and human women. The offspring of these unions were called various names depending on the text. Sometimes they are described simply as mighty men, rulers, or heroes. Other fragments refer to them as possessing qualities beyond normal humans, wisdom, strength, beauty, or lifespan far exceeding that of ordinary mortals. These hybrid beings occupied a space between the divine and the earthly. They were not fully human, but neither were they gods. They were something in between, and their existence troubled the cosmic order. This theme appears across multiple mythologies, not just Sumerian. The Nephilim of Hebrew tradition, born from the sons of God and the daughters of men. The Titans of Greek myth, half-divine beings who challenged the gods. The demigods of Hindu epics, warriors and kings with celestial parentage. The pattern repeats, and in every case, these hybrid beings are associated with the world before a great cataclysm. Their existence is a symptom of something gone wrong, a boundary crossed, a sacred order violated. And in every case, they are swept away by flood, fire, or divine wrath. The Sumerian texts are more reserved in their descriptions, but the implication is clear. The antediluvian world became corrupted, not morally in the way later religions would frame sin, but structurally. The separation between divine and human, which was supposed to be absolute, had been compromised. Knowledge that was meant to remain with the Anunnaki had leaked into human hands. Humanity, designed to serve, had begun to aspire. And perhaps most troubling of all, they had begun to multiply. The Atrahasis epic is explicit on this point. The gods grew disturbed, not by human wickedness, but by human noise. The land became wide, the people became numerous. The gods were troubled by their noise. Enlil could not sleep because of the clamour. It was not sin that provoked the flood. It was population. Humanity had become too many, too loud, too unmanageable. The experiment had exceeded its parameters. And so the decision was made. Wipe it clean. Start again. Reduce the population to a manageable number and ensure that such expansion could never happen again. But before that decision was enacted, the antediluvian world reached heights that, according to the texts, would not be seen again for thousands of years. Consider the knowledge embedded in Sumerian astronomy. The texts name all the planets of our solar system, not just the ones visible to the naked eye, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, but all of them, including Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, bodies that modern science did not confirm until the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries respectively, using telescopes and mathematical prediction. How could the Sumerians have known? One seal in particular, catalogue number VA 243, housed in the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin, has become the centre of intense debate. The seal depicts a star surrounded by 11 smaller spheres. Researchers like Zechariah Sitchin argued that this represents the Sun and the planets, a complete map of the solar system carved into stone over 4,000 years ago. Critics counter that the image is symbolic, that the spheres represent stars, not planets, and that reading it as a solar system diagram is over-interpretation. And yet the Sumerians possessed astronomical knowledge that should not exist in their time period. They knew the earth was round. They understood it rotated. They charted the precession of the equinoxes, that slow wobble of Earth's axis requiring 26,000 years to complete a full cycle. They tracked Venus with perfect accuracy. They recorded the orbital periods of outer planets. Where did this knowledge come from? Trial and error over centuries. Perhaps. Or perhaps it was inherited. Passed down from the antediluvian world, where the Anunnaki, beings with longer lifespans or advanced instruments, had already completed the observations and simply taught the results to humanity. The texts describe the Anunnaki possessing me, not just the cultural or legal kind, but cosmological me. The codes that governed planetary motion, the structure of the heavens, the mathematics of celestial cycles. To possess these me was to possess power. And in the world before the flood, that power was concentrated in the hands of the Anunnaki and their chosen kings. These kings, the antediluvian rulers with their impossible reigns, were not elected. They were appointed. The texts describe kingship as something that descended from heaven. Enmenlu-Ana, one of the Prediluvian kings, is called beloved of the gods, chosen by Anu, the sky god, and granted authority over humanity. Another king, Ziusudra, the Sumerian Noah, is described as pious, God-fearing, and privy to divine secrets. He was not a rebel. He was an insider, someone trusted enough to be warned when the flood was coming. Daily life in these antediluvian cities, as depicted in fragments and reconstructed from later texts that reference the old world, was highly stratified. At the top were the Anunnaki, residing in temples that doubled as command centers. Below them were the kings and priests, intermediaries who carried out divine will. Then came the administrators, scribes who recorded everything, grain stores, labor assignments, celestial observations, water distribution. Below them were the craftsmen, metal workers, architects, weavers, those whose skills maintained the infrastructure of civilization. And at the bottom were the laborers, the masses of humanity performing the endless work that kept the cities functioning. It was not a society of equality. It was a hierarchy, rigid and divinely mandated, but it was also stable. The texts describe abundance, grain overflowing from storehouses, canals running clear and full, festivals honoring the gods with music, beer, bread, and ritual. There was order, there was knowledge, there was continuity. And that perhaps is what made the decision to destroy it so incomprehensible. Why would the gods, having established this system, having created humanity specifically to maintain it, choose to annihilate everything? The texts offer several answers, none of them entirely satisfying. Overpopulation, noise, corruption of bloodlines, humanity's failure to remain obedient. But beneath these surface reasons, there is a darker implication. The antediluvian world had become something the Anunnaki could no longer control. Humanity had learned too much, remembered too much, perhaps even begun to question. In one fragment, Enlil declares that humanity has become too wise. In another, the mingling of divine and human bloodlines is described as an abomination, a violation that destabilizes the cosmic order. The offspring of these unions, possessing partial divine knowledge and extended lifespans, represent a threat, not to humanity, but to the gods themselves. If humans could become like the Anunnaki, if they could access the me, wield the knowledge, live for centuries, then what use were the gods? The decision to flood the world was not punishment, it was course correction, a reset, a way to preserve the system by eliminating the variables that had destabilized it. And so, the waters came. Not as divine wrath in the moral sense, but as an administrative solution. The experiment had failed, time to start over, but not entirely. One man was chosen, one family, one set of instructions. Ziusudra in Sumerian, Atrahasis in Akkadian, Utnapishtim in Babylonian. The survivor, the one who carried forward the knowledge of the antediluvian world, reduced and fragmented, but not entirely lost. And this is where the texts become most haunting, because they describe the post-diluvian world, our world, not as an advancement, but as a diminishment. The kings after the flood have shorter reigns. The cities are smaller. The knowledge is partial. Humanity struggles to rebuild what was once effortless. And the Anunnaki, though still present in the early centuries, grow increasingly distant. The age of direct contact fades. The gods withdraw. And humanity is left alone with clay tablets and fragmented memories, trying desperately to remember what the world was like before the waters rose. Perhaps that is the true tragedy encoded in these ancient texts. Not that the flood happened, but that we survived it, that we were allowed to continue, but only in diminished form. That the knowledge we now possess, the science, the astronomy, the mathematics, is not progress forward, but recovery backward. An attempt to reconstruct what was once whole. And every temple we build, every formula we preserve, every star chart we carve into stone is not an achievement. It is an act of mourning, a monument to the world that drowned and the knowledge that went with it. The antediluvian world, if the Sumerians are to be believed, was not a paradise. It was not Eden, but it was complete. It was ordered. It possessed something we have spent all of recorded history trying to reclaim. And perhaps the deepest mystery is not whether it existed, but but whether we will ever recover what was lost when the waters finally receded and the mud dried under a silent sky. The stories carved into clay are one thing. The ground itself tells another. In 1929, British archaeologist Leonard Woolley stood at the bottom of a trench in southern Iraq, staring at something that should not have been there. He had been excavating the ancient city of Ur, digging through layers of pottery, tools, and building foundations, following the stratigraphic record downward through time. And then, suddenly, the artifacts stopped. Beneath the habitation layers, beneath the temples and homes and workshops, Woolley's team hid a band of clean, water-deposited clay. No pottery, no tools, no charcoal, no trash, just smooth, sterile sediment, 8 feet of it. Woolley kept digging. Below the clay, the artifacts resumed. Older pottery styles, different architectural techniques, evidence of human occupation stretching back into periods that had no names yet. 2 distinct civilizations, separated by an unbroken layer of mud. He knew immediately what he was looking at. A flood. Not a seasonal inundation, not a spring overflow, but a catastrophic deluge powerful enough to bury an entire city, erase its inhabitants, and leave behind only silence and sediment. The kind of event that survivors would remember forever. The kind of event they would write down, pass to their children, and carve into every sacred text they produced for the next 3,000 years. Woolley believed he had found evidence of the biblical flood. The newspapers called it proof. Scholars were more cautious, but no one disputed the layer itself. The mud was real, the destruction was real, and it was not isolated to Ur. Over the following decades, as excavations spread across Mesopotamia, archaeologists found the same signature at site after site. Uruk, one of the world's first great cities, showed a thick deposit of alluvial clay dated to roughly 2900 BCE, separating earlier settlement layers from later reconstruction. Shuruppak, the city where Ziusudra, the Sumerian Noah, was said to have ruled, revealed multiple flood strata, evidence of repeated catastrophic inundations. Kish, Lagash, Nineveh, all bore the scars. Layers of silt and clay interrupting the archaeological record like punctuation marks in a sentence written by water. The floods were not synchronous. The layers did not all date to the same decade or even the same century. Some were earlier, some later. Some cities flooded, while others remained dry. This was not a single global deluge covering the entire earth, but it was something, a series of catastrophic events that struck the Mesopotamian plain with enough regularity and violence that the people living there came to see flooding not as an anomaly, but as an inevitability, a cosmic reset, a divine punishment. The way the world ended and began again. And the timing is remarkable. The flood layers cluster around a narrow window, roughly 3000 to 2900 BCE, the precise transitional period between the Ubaid culture, the region's earliest widespread civilization, and the emergence of the Sumerians. Before the floods, we see scattered villages, simple pottery, basic agriculture. After the floods, we see cities, writing, monumental architecture, centralized government, organized religion, as though the deluge had not merely destroyed civilization, but catalyzed it, as though the survivors rebuilt with urgency, as though they understood that knowledge could be lost, that memory was fragile, and that the only way to preserve what they knew was to write it down, build it in stone, encode it in ritual, and never, ever forget. But what caused the floods? The Mesopotamian plain is a flatland, cradled between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, stretching from the Persian Gulf to the foothills of the Zagros Mountains. It is one of the most flood-prone regions on Earth. Seasonal rains, snowmelt from the mountains, and the unpredictable surges of the rivers have always made life here precarious. Even a modest rise in water levels could turn the plain into a shallow sea, drowning villages, destroying crops, and displacing populations. To the people living there, such an event would feel apocalyptic. Total. The end of the world. Modern geology confirms this. Core samples taken from the region show evidence of massive sediment deposition events consistent with catastrophic flooding. Climate data from ice cores and tree rings indicate a period of intense climatic instability around 3000 BCE, marked by sudden temperature shifts, increased precipitation, and glacial melting. Sea levels were rising globally as the last ice age released its grip. Coastlines were redrawn, river systems swelled. And in low-lying regions like Mesopotamia, the result would have been devastating. But there is another possibility, one that stretches beyond the rivers, beyond the plain, beyond Mesopotamia itself. In the mid-1990s, geologists William Ryan and Walter Pittman proposed a theory that sent shockwaves through the archaeological community. They called it the Black Sea deluge hypothesis. According to their research, around 5600 BCE, the Black Sea was not a sea at all, but a massive freshwater lake, smaller and lower than it is today, surrounded by fertile plains where early farmers had settled. Then, as global sea levels rose, the Mediterranean began to press against the narrow land bridge separating it from the Black Sea basin. Eventually, the pressure became too great. The barrier collapsed. Seawater poured through the Bosporus Strait with the force of 200 Niagara Falls, flooding the basin at a rate of tens of thousands of cubic meters per second. Within months, the lake became a sea. Coastlines retreated by kilometers. Entire landscapes vanished beneath the waves. The people living there would have had no warning, no time to prepare. They would have watched the horizon darken, heard the roar, and then run. Those who survived would have scattered, carrying with them the memory of a world drowned in a single season. And some of those survivors may have migrated south, following river valleys, seeking new lands, bringing with them stories of the deluge that had consumed their homeland. Could the Black Sea flood be the event encoded in Sumerian memory? The dates don't align perfectly. The Black Sea event predates the Sumerian flood layers by more than 2 millennia, but memory is not precise. Stories compress, details merge. A catastrophic flood in one region, passed down through generations, could blend with later floods in another, creating a composite narrative that feels both ancient and immediate. A memory of water so deep, so total, that it becomes the archetype for every disaster that follows. And there is more. Göbekli Tepe. The name means Potbelly Hill, an unassuming mound in southeastern Turkey that hid one of archaeology's greatest revelations. Discovered in the 1990s, excavated painstakingly over the following decades, Göbekli Tepe is a complex of massive stone pillars arranged in circular enclosures, carved with intricate reliefs of animals, abstract symbols, and humanoid figures. It dates to approximately 9600 BCE, 11,000 years ago, 6 millennia before the Sumerians, 4 millennia before Stonehenge. It predates pottery, metallurgy, and permanent settlements. The people who built Göbekli Tepe were supposed to be hunter-gatherers, nomadic bands living hand to mouth. Yet they quarried, transported, and erected stones weighing up to 16 tons, organized labor on a scale that implies social complexity, and created art that rivals anything produced in later civilizations. And then, around 8000 BCE, they buried it, deliberately. The entire site was filled in with rubble and soil, preserved beneath the earth like a time capsule. Why? No one knows. Some suggest it was a ritual closure, a way of sealing the sacred. Others propose that it was hidden, protected from some threat, preserved for a future generation to rediscover. Or perhaps it was simply abandoned, covered by wind and time, forgotten as the people who built it moved on or vanished. But Göbekli Tepe is not alone. Across Anatolia, the Levant, and the Fertile Crescent, archaeologists are uncovering sites that push the boundaries of what we thought possible. Karahan Tepe, Nevali Chori, Çatalhöyük, each one revealing evidence of architectural sophistication, symbolic thought, and organized society thousands of years before the dawn of civilization in Sumer. These were not primitive experiments. They were fully realized expressions of human capability. And then, most of them, they stopped, abandoned, buried, forgotten. What happened? Climate change is the standard answer. The Younger Dryas, a sudden return to glacial conditions around 10,800 BCE, would have made life unbearable in many regions. Then, just as suddenly, it ended. Temperatures spiked, ice sheets collapsed, sea levels rose rapidly, coastlines flooded, ecosystems shifted. Entire populations would have been displaced, forced to migrate, adapt, or die. The survivors would have carried their knowledge with them, fragments of what they once knew, seeds of civilization waiting for the right conditions to take root again. And perhaps they did. Perhaps the people who built Göbekli Tepe, or their descendants, or their knowledge, eventually reached the plains of Mesopotamia. Perhaps they settled along the rivers, adapted to the new environment, and began to rebuild. And perhaps after another catastrophic flood around 3000 BCE, they rebuilt again. This time with writing, this time with permanence, this time ensuring that the knowledge would not be lost. Because the artifacts found in the pre-flood layers of Sumerian sites are not primitive. Pottery from Ubaid period Eridu shows advanced wheel-thrown techniques, standardized forms, and decorative patterns that suggest centralized production. Stone tools from early Uruk are finely crafted, specialized, evidence of occupational diversity. Seals and tokens used for accounting predate cuneiform writing, indicating a system of record-keeping already in place before the first tablets were inscribed. These were not people stumbling towards civilization. They were people already there, already organized, already capable. And beneath them, beneath the flood layers, the remains go deeper still. Structures that are older, stranger, harder to explain. At Eridu, beneath the foundation of the temple of Enki, archaeologists found 17 earlier temples, each one built directly atop the ruins of the one before, stretching back into periods where no written records exist. The deepest layers contained pottery styles that do not match anything else in the region, tools made from materials not locally sourced, architectural techniques that appear suddenly, fully formed, with no developmental sequence leading up to them. It is as though the Sumerians were not the first, as though they were inheriting something, building on foundations that were already ancient when they arrived. Modern climate science offers another clue. Around 3000 BCE, a cosmic impact event may have occurred. Evidence from ice cores, geological formations, and mythological sources points to a possible airburst or comet fragment striking the Earth, triggering sudden climatic shifts, intense rainfall, and regional flooding. Some researchers have linked this to the biblical story of Sodom and Gomorrah, others to widespread flood myths across the Mediterranean and Near East. The evidence is fragmentary, contested, but tantalizing. What if the Sumerian flood was not just a river overflow, but the result of something far more dramatic? A celestial event that brought fire and water together, melting glaciers, raising seas, and reshaping the world in a matter of years. The survivors of such an event would remember it as divine wrath. They would record it as the moment the gods decided to reset creation. And they would do everything in their power to ensure that the knowledge they carried, the wisdom of the pre-flood world, was never lost again. Perhaps that is why the Sumerians wrote so obsessively, why they recorded everything: star charts, medical formulas, legal codes, hymns, king lists, flood stories. Because they understood, in a way we have forgotten, that civilization is fragile. That knowledge can vanish in a single generation if it is not preserved. That the line between order and chaos is as thin as the clay beneath your feet. The mud tells the story. The cities buried beneath it remember. And somewhere, in the layers still unexcavated, still waiting beneath the sands of Iraq and the hills of Turkey and the floors of the Persian Gulf, there are more answers, more evidence of what came before, more fragments of the world that drowned. The flood was real. The question is not whether it happened. The question is what it destroyed and who survived to tell the tale. The flood story did not belong to Sumer alone. That is perhaps the most unsettling thing about it. The narrative of a great deluge sent to destroy humanity appears not just in Mesopotamia, but in Egypt, India, Greece, China, Mesoamerica, the Andes, the Pacific Islands, and among indigenous tribes of North America, Australia, and Africa. Over 200 distinct flood legends have been documented across cultures separated by oceans, mountains, and millennia. Cultures with no known contact, no shared language, no trade routes. And yet the stories echo one another with a consistency that refuses to be dismissed as coincidence. A divine decision to destroy humanity. Rising waters that cover the earth. A chosen survivor warned in advance. A vessel constructed to preserve life. Animals taken aboard in pairs or groups. A bird sent out to test for dry land. A mountain where the vessel comes to rest. A sacrifice offered in gratitude. A covenant or promise made by the divine that such destruction will not happen again. The details shift. The names change. The gods wear different faces. But the structure remains intact, like the skeleton of something enormous buried beneath the surface of human memory, revealing itself in fragments wherever you dig. The most famous parallel is also the closest. The Epic of Gilgamesh, carved into Akkadian tablets around 2100 BCE, preserves a flood narrative that mirrors the Sumerian account so precisely it can only be a later retelling of the same event. In this version, the survivor is named Utnapishtim, and the story is told as a flashback within the larger epic. Gilgamesh, seeking immortality after the death of his friend Enkidu, travels to the edge of the world to meet the one human who has escaped death. Utnapishtim, the man who survived the flood. Utnapishtim tells Gilgamesh that the gods, disturbed by the noise and overpopulation of humanity, decided to send a deluge. But Ea, the god of wisdom, equivalent to the Sumerian Enki, whispered a warning through the reed walls of Utnapishtim's house. "Build a boat," Ea commanded. "Seal it with bitumen. Take aboard the seed of all living things." Utnapishtim obeyed. He constructed a massive vessel 6 decks high, with equal dimensions on all sides, a cube floating on the waters of annihilation. When the rains came, they lasted 6 days and 6 nights. The storm was so fierce that even the gods cowered in fear, retreating to the highest heavens, trembling like dogs at what they had unleashed. When the waters subsided, the boat came to rest on Mount Nemush. Utnapishtim released a dove. It found no place to land and returned. He released a swallow. It too returned. Finally, he released a raven, and it did not come back. The earth was dry. Utnapishtim emerged, built an altar, and offered sacrifice. The gods, smelling the sweet savour, gathered around like flies, realizing too late that they had nearly destroyed the very beings who worshipped them. Ea rebuked the gods for their recklessness, and Enlil, the chief deity who had ordered the flood, granted Utnapishtim and his wife immortality as compensation. They were taken to dwell at the mouth of the rivers, beyond the reach of death, the last survivors of the world before. The parallels to the biblical account are undeniable. Genesis chapters 6 through 9 tell the story of Noah, a righteous man in a corrupt generation, chosen by God to survive a flood that would cleanse the earth. God commands Noah to build an ark, specifying its dimensions: 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, 30 cubits high, 3 decks, a door in the side, sealed with pitch. Noah is instructed to bring aboard his family in pairs of every living creature, 7 pairs of clean animals, 2 of the unclean. The rain falls for 40 days and 40 nights. The waters cover the earth for 150 days. The ark comes to rest on the mountains of Ararat. Noah releases a raven, then a dove, then another dove, which returns with an olive branch. The earth is dry. Noah builds an altar and offers burnt sacrifices. God smells the pleasing aroma and promises never again to curse the ground or destroy all living creatures. A rainbow is set in the sky as a covenant, a sign that the waters will not return. For centuries, scholars assumed the biblical account was the original, that Moses had received it by divine revelation. But in 1872, George Smith, a British archaeologist working in the basement of the British Museum, deciphered a fragment of cuneiform that shattered that assumption. It was part of the Epic of Gilgamesh, and it described a flood nearly identical to Noah's. The tablet predated the biblical text by at least 1,000 years. The implications were immediate and unavoidable. The Genesis account was not unique. It was a Hebrew adaptation of a much older Mesopotamian tradition, carried forward from Sumerian through Akkadian and Babylonian sources, preserved in the cultural memory of the exiled Israelites who lived in Babylon during the 6th century BCE. But if the flood story could travel from Sumer to Babylon to Jerusalem, where else had it gone? And more disturbingly, what if it hadn't travelled at all? What if it had always been there, embedded in the collective memory of humanity, because humanity had experienced it? In the Hindu tradition, the earliest texts, the Vedas and Puranas, describe a great flood sent to destroy the world at the end of a cosmic cycle. The survivor is Manu, the progenitor of the current human race. One day, while performing ablutions in a river, Manu finds a small fish struggling in the water. The fish begs him for protection, promising that in return it will save him from a coming catastrophe. Manu places the fish in a jar. It grows rapidly, forcing him to move it to a larger tank, then to a pond, then to the river, and finally to the ocean, where the fish reveals itself as Matsya, an avatar of the god Vishnu. Matsya warns Manu that a great flood will soon engulf the world. he instructs him to build a large boat and take aboard the 7 great sages, seeds of all plants, and pairs of all animals. When the deluge comes, Matsya, now enormous, pulls the boat through the raging waters with a rope tied to his horn. The flood lasts for many ages, submerging even the highest mountains. When the waters recede, the boat comes to rest on the summit of the Himalayas. Manu alone of all humanity survives, and from him, the world is repopulated. The texts specify that Manu preserved not just life, but knowledge, the sacred Vedas, the hymns and rituals that would allow civilization to be reborn. The Greek tradition offers a parallel so precise it might have been copied, except the Greeks had no known contact with India or Mesopotamia at the time these myths were forming. In their account, Zeus, enraged by the wickedness of humanity during the Bronze Age, decides to destroy the world with a flood. Prometheus, the Titan who had stolen fire for humanity, warns his son Deucalion. Deucalion builds a wooden chest, a primitive ark, and takes aboard his wife, Pyrrha. The rains fall for 9 days and 9 nights. All of humanity perishes except for Deucalion and Pyrrha. Their vessel comes to rest on Mount Parnassus. When the waters recede, they offer sacrifice to Zeus, who sends Hermes to grant them a wish. They ask for humanity to be restored. The gods instruct them to throw stones over their shoulders. The stones thrown by Deucalion become men. Those thrown by Pyrrha become women. Humanity is reborn from the bones of the earth, quite literally reconstructed from the remnants of the world before. Across the Pacific, in the high deserts of the American Southwest, the Hopi people preserve a flood narrative that speaks of multiple worlds destroyed and remade. According to their tradition, the first world was destroyed by fire when humanity became corrupt. The second world was destroyed by ice. The third world was destroyed by water, a great flood sent because people had forgotten the teachings of the Creator and turned to evil. The virtuous were warned by Spider-Woman, a deity who guided them to hollow reeds. They climbed inside and floated on the surface of the rising waters while the world below was cleansed. When the flood subsided, they emerged into the fourth world, the current age, carrying with them the sacred knowledge needed to live in balance. To the south, the Aztec codices describe a series of world ages, each ending in catastrophe. The fourth age, the age of water, was destroyed by a flood that lasted 52 years. The sky collapsed and the waters consumed everything. Only one man, Tata, and one woman, Neni, survived by hiding in a hollow log. When the waters receded, they emerged to find a world empty of life. The gods, angry that anyone had survived, transformed them into dogs. Later, the gods relented and created a new race of humans from the bones of the previous age, ground into powder and mixed with the blood of the gods. The Inca tradition speaks of a great flood sent by the creator god, Viracocha, to destroy the giants who once inhabited the earth. Only 2 people survived, a brother and sister who took refuge in a cave. When the waters receded, they emerged to find the world silent and empty. Viracocha appeared to them and taught them how to rebuild, how to plant, how to make fire, how to raise children. From them, the human race began again. The story is preserved in the chronicles of the Spanish conquest, recorded by priests who noted, with some discomfort, how closely it resembled the biblical account they had come to preach. In China, the Great Flood is not a myth relegated to prehistory. It appears in historical texts as an event that defined the early dynasties. During the reign of Emperor Yao, around 2300 BCE, the waters rose and inundated the land for generations. The flood was so catastrophic that it became the central crisis of the age. Gun, a legendary figure, was tasked with controlling the waters but failed. His son, Yu, succeeded by dredging channels and building canals, guiding the floodwaters back to the sea. For his efforts, Yu was made emperor, founding the Xia dynasty. The flood was not divine punishment in the Chinese version. It was a natural disaster, a cosmic imbalance that required human ingenuity and labor to resolve. But the scale was the same. Waters covering the land, civilization on the brink of collapse, a hero who preserved order and allowed humanity to continue. Even in Australia, among the Aboriginal peoples whose oral traditions stretch back tens of thousands of years, flood stories persist. The Kurnai people of southeastern Australia tell of a time when the sea rose rapidly, drowning the land and forcing people to flee to the mountains. The Gundungurra people speak of a great flood that covered the earth, sent as punishment, with only a few survivors who climbed to the highest peaks. These stories, embedded in songlines and dreamtime narratives, are among the oldest continuously preserved oral traditions on earth, and they too remember water, rising, unstoppable, erasing the world. Why? That is the question that refuses to go away. Why would cultures on opposite sides of the planet, with no writing, no ships capable of ocean crossings, no means of communication, develop nearly identical flood narratives? The standard academic explanation is that floods are common. Rivers overflow, storms bring devastation, coastal communities experience tsunamis. Every culture eventually will face a catastrophic flood, and each will preserve the memory in myth. Local events become universal in the retelling. Hyperbole and religious interpretation transform a regional disaster into a cosmic one. But that explanation struggles under the weight of the specifics. These are not vague stories about water. They are detailed, structured accounts with recurring motifs. Divine judgment, a single family saved, a vessel of refuge, birds sent to find land, a mountain of landing, a promise or covenant. If each culture were independently mythologizing local floods, we would expect chaotic diversity, wildly different details reflecting different geographies and theologies. Instead, we find uniformity. We find the same story, rewritten in different languages, adapted to different gods, but preserving the same essential truth. Some researchers suggest a common ancestral source, a Proto-Indo-European or even older flood myth carried by migrating populations as they spread across the globe. The story could have travelled with humans as they left Africa, crossed into the Middle East, moved into Europe, Asia, and eventually across the Bering Land Bridge into the Americas. One original event, remembered and retold, diverging over millennia, but never entirely losing its shape. That would explain the consistency. But it raises another question. If the flood story is that old enough to predate the dispersal of human populations, then it predates civilization itself. It predates writing, agriculture, cities. What kind of flood could have been so catastrophic, so universally traumatic, that pre-civilized humans carried its memory for tens of thousands of years? Or, and this is where the ground shifts beneath us, what if the stories are not exaggerations? What if they are not mythologized memories of local floods? What if they are fragmented, culturally adapted records of a single global event? A deluge so vast, so destructive, that it reset human civilization and survived in the collective memory of every society that emerged afterward. Not because they learned the story from one another, but because they all survived the same disaster. The geological record shows evidence of rapid sea level rise at the end of the last ice age, around 10,000 to 8,000 BCE. The melting of glacial ice sheets caused oceans to rise by more than 400 feet over a few thousand years. Coastal settlements, if they existed, would have been drowned, entire landscapes submerged, river valleys flooded. Some researchers point to events like the flooding of the Black Sea Basin around 5,600 BCE, when rising Mediterranean waters breached a natural dam and inundated a vast freshwater lake in a matter of months, forcing mass migration. Others suggest comet impacts, volcanic eruptions, or subsurface crustal displacement, any of which could trigger tsunamis and flooding on a scale difficult to imagine. But if such an event occurred, if there was a real flood vast enough to traumatize the ancient world, then the stories are not myths. They are testimony, and the survivors, scattered across the globe, each rebuilding in isolation, would naturally preserve the memory in the language and symbolism of their own emerging cultures. The Sumerian Ziusudra becomes the Babylonian Utnapishtim, who becomes the Hebrew Noah, who echoes the Hindu Manu, the Greek Deucalion, the Chinese Yu, the Hopi ancestors in their reeds. Different names, same man, or at least the same experience, the same terror, the same desperate hope, the same moment when everything was lost, and a few somehow endured. And if that is true, if these are not fables but fractured history, then the question becomes inescapable. What else did they remember? What other knowledge? What other stories? What other truths about the world before the flood have been encoded in myth, waiting for us to learn how to read them properly? The Sumerians said civilization was given, not invented. The Greeks said knowledge came from Prometheus, stolen from the gods. The Egyptians said it came from Thoth, the Hindu from the Rishis, the Mesoamericans from Quetzalcoatl. Every culture remembers teachers, bringers of knowledge, beings who came from somewhere else or some other time to instruct humanity in the arts of survival. Perhaps that is the deepest echo of all. Not just the flood, but what came before it, and who or what made sure that not everything was forgotten. What are we to make of all this? The tablets inscribed with memories of a world before the flood, the Anunnaki descending from the heavens, the sudden emergence of civilization complete with writing, astronomy, and mathematics. How do we reconcile these ancient texts with what we think we know about the deep past? The academic establishment has largely settled on an answer, one that preserves the boundaries of consensus history. The Sumerian flood myths, they tell us, are just that. Myths. Symbolic stories created to explain natural disasters that the ancient Mesopotamians witnessed firsthand. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers flooded regularly, sometimes catastrophically. Communities were destroyed. Livestock drowned. Fields disappeared beneath muddy water. To people without scientific frameworks, such disasters would have seemed apocalyptic, divinely ordained, a cleansing of the world itself. According to this interpretation, the Sumerians took these localized flooding events and amplified them into cosmic narrative. They transformed regional catastrophes into universal judgment, human kings into immortal survivors, and the gods who controlled the weather into deliberate architects of extinction. It's a literary device, scholars argue, a way of processing trauma, explaining suffering and asserting moral order in a chaotic universe. The flood myth becomes theology, not history, metaphor, not memory. And there is evidence for this view. The Mesopotamian floodplain is geologically prone to inundation. Archaeological excavations have uncovered multiple layers of flood deposits at sites like Uruk, and Shuruppak. Thick strata of clean clay sandwiched between occupation layers. Evidence that these cities were indeed submerged, abandoned, then rebuilt. But these floods were not simultaneous. They occurred at different times, in different places. No single deluge erased all of Mesopotamian civilization. No 7-day rainstorm covered the world. So the scholarly consensus holds firm. The Eridu Genesis, the Atrahasis epic, the story of Ziusudra. These are mythologized memories of real but limited disasters. Localized, explicable, human-scale catastrophes elevated to divine drama through the narrative art of ancient priests. Case closed. Except the case refuses to close. Because there are problems with this neat explanation. Problems that whisper from the edges of the data, refusing to be silenced. First, there is the matter of consistency. If each culture's flood myth emerged independently from local flooding events, why do they share such specific details? The warning from the gods, the command to build a vessel, the preservation of animals, the sending of birds to test for dry land, the landing on a mountaintop. These narrative beats appear not just in Mesopotamia, but across the world. From Greece to India, from China to the Americas. Flood myths that describe not seasonal river overflow, but world-ending cataclysm. Waters that covered mountains. Waters that lasted for months. Waters that erased previous civilizations entirely. How do we explain the Inca legends of Viracocha, who emerged from Lake Titicaca after a great flood destroyed the world? Or the Hopi traditions of multiple worlds destroyed by water, with only a few survivors ascending to the next? Or the Aboriginal Australian stories of a time when the sea rose and swallowed the coastal lands, forcing the ancestors to flee to higher ground? These are not river valleys prone to seasonal flooding. These are cultures separated by oceans, by thousands of miles, by linguistic and genetic isolation. And yet they all remember the same thing. Water, rising, consuming, nearly ending everything. Coincidence? Archetypal psychology emerging from the human subconscious. Perhaps. Or perhaps they remember because something happened. Something older and larger than localized floods in ancient Mesopotamia. Enter the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, a theory that sits uncomfortably at the boundary between mainstream science and controversial speculation, but one that refuses to go away. Around 12,800 years ago, the Earth was emerging from the last ice age. Glaciers that had covered much of North America and Europe were retreating. The climate was warming. Humanity was transitioning from nomadic hunting to the first experiments with agriculture. And then, suddenly, everything reversed. Temperatures plummeted. The glaciers stopped melting, or in some regions, began advancing again. This cold snap, known as the Younger Dryas period, lasted for roughly 1,200 years before temperatures abruptly warmed again and the Ice Age finally ended. For decades, scientists attributed the Younger Dryas to changes in ocean circulation, shifts in the Gulf Stream, natural climate variability. But in recent years, a more dramatic explanation has emerged. What if the temperature reversal was triggered by a cosmic impact? A comet or asteroid fragmenting in Earth's atmosphere, exploding over the North American ice sheet with the force of millions of nuclear weapons. The evidence is fragmentary, but compelling. A layer of sediment dated to approximately 10,800 BCE, right at the beginning of the Younger Dryas, contains unusual materials. Nanodiamonds formed only under extreme pressure, microscopic spherules of melted rock, charcoal indicating massive wildfires, iridium, an element rare on Earth but common in asteroids. And perhaps most tellingly, a black mat layer found across dozens of archaeological sites in North America, a carbon-rich deposit that suggests widespread burning. If the impact hypothesis is correct, the consequences would have been unimaginable. The explosions would have instantly melted portions of the ice sheet, releasing catastrophic floods, tsunamis hundreds of feet high, rivers of meltwater carving out landscapes in hours that should have taken millennia. The Great Lakes Basin, the Scablands of Washington State, the English Channel, all possibly carved or expanded by sudden, violent deluges triggered by the impacts. And then the fires. Debris from the explosion raining down as superheated ejecta, igniting forests across continents. Smoke and ash filling the atmosphere, blocking sunlight, triggering the cold snap that would last over a millennium. Megafauna, the great mammals of the Pleistocene, mammoths, saber-toothed cats, giant sloths, went extinct within a geologically instant window, not slowly, not gradually, but suddenly, as though something catastrophic had removed them from the world all at once. Human populations would have been devastated. The Clovis culture of North America, once widespread, disappears from the archaeological record right at the Younger Dryas boundary, not gradually declining, but vanishing. In Europe, populations contracted, sites were abandoned, and genetic evidence suggests a population bottleneck, a sharp reduction in human numbers. Could this be the flood? Not a metaphor, not a myth, but a memory. A real, world-altering cataclysm that nearly erased humanity, preserved in the oral traditions of survivors who scattered to distant shores and rebuilt from the ruins. The hypothesis remains controversial. Some geologists dispute the impact evidence, arguing that the materials can be explained by terrestrial processes. But other researchers continue to find supporting data. Impact craters potentially dating to this period, genetic evidence of population bottlenecks in multiple species, archaeological sites showing sudden abandonment, and always the flood myths. Hundreds of them, across every inhabited continent, all describing the same event. If the Younger Dryas impact occurred, if it triggered floods that reshaped coastlines and drowned entire regions, then we must ask a more unsettling question. What was lost? What kind of civilization existed before the waters rose? Mainstream archaeology has long assumed a linear model of human progress. Hunter-gatherers, then simple farmers, then villages, then cities, then writing, then complex states, a ladder ascending from simplicity to sophistication. And by this model, 12,800 years ago, humanity was barely beginning. Small bands of hunters tracking game, no agriculture, no permanent settlements, no technology beyond stone tools and hide clothing. Certainly no civilization that could be described as advanced. But the assumption of linear progress is just that, an assumption. And it's an assumption increasingly challenged by anomalous evidence. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, dated to approximately 9,600 BCE, just after the Younger Dryas ended. Massive stone pillars, some weighing over 10 tons, carved with intricate reliefs of animals, arranged in circular complexes that suggest astronomical alignment. This is not the work of primitive hunter-gatherers stumbling into sedentary life. This is monumental architecture requiring organization, planning, specialized labor, and knowledge. Knowledge of geometry, astronomy, and engineering. And it was built by people who supposedly had not yet invented agriculture. Or had they? Recent analysis of residues at Göbekli Tepe suggests the people who built it were brewing beer, processing grains, engaging in ritual feasting. Perhaps agriculture was not slowly invented through trial and error. Perhaps it was remembered, recovered from a time before the floods when such knowledge was already established. And Göbekli Tepe is not alone. Across the world, sites dated to the immediate post-Younger Dryas period show surprising sophistication. Çatalhöyük in Anatolia, Jericho in the Levant. Ancient settlements that appear suddenly, already organized, already building in stone, already practicing irrigation. As though the knowledge of civilization had not been gradually developed, but rapidly deployed by people who remembered how it was done. Could there have been an advanced culture before the Younger Dryas, a civilization that mastered agriculture, astronomy, perhaps even maritime navigation and monumental architecture? A culture that was largely destroyed by the cataclysm, with only scattered survivors carrying fragments of their knowledge into the post-flood world. This is where the discussion becomes truly controversial. Because once we open the door to pre-flood civilization, we must confront the more extreme interpretations. The theories that mainstream academia dismisses, sometimes with derision, but which refuse to fade from popular imagination. The ancient astronaut hypothesis, the idea that the Anunnaki were not gods, not myths, not symbolic representations of natural forces, but actual beings, visitors from another world who came to Earth in the deep past, genetically engineered modern humans, and taught the survivors of the flood how to rebuild civilization. Proponents of this theory point to the same evidence we've explored: the sudden appearance of Sumerian civilization fully formed, the astronomical knowledge that should have taken generations to acquire, the descriptions of the Anunnaki as beings of light who descended from the sky in vessels of fire, the cylinder seals depicting what looked like planetary diagrams and technological devices, the persistent global myths of sky gods bringing knowledge to humanity. They ask, why would the Sumerians describe their gods as coming from the heavens if it were purely symbolic? Why would they carve images of what appear to be astronauts and celestial maps if they were only representing earthly kings and agricultural cycles? Why would they meticulously record planetary orbits with a precision that suggests either advanced instruments or information provided by someone who had seen the solar system from above? Mainstream scholars counter with reasonable explanations. The astronomical knowledge could have been accumulated through patient observation. The descriptions of descent from heaven could be mythological metaphor. The technological-looking imagery could be misinterpreted by modern eyes trained to see machinery in abstract symbols. And the consistency of flood myths across cultures could reflect independent responses to universal human experiences of natural disaster. These are rational arguments, grounded in parsimony, in Occam's razor, in the principle that we should prefer simpler explanations over extraordinary ones. And they hold sway in academic institutions for good reason. Evidence for extraterrestrial visitation remains circumstantial at best. No spacecraft recovered, no alien artifacts with unambiguous non-terrestrial signatures, no genetic markers that definitively prove artificial manipulation of human DNA. And yet the questions linger, because the alternative hypothesis, the mainstream view, also requires us to accept extraordinary coincidences. That multiple cultures independently invented nearly identical flood myths, that the Sumerians accidentally stumbled into advanced mathematics and astronomy without any foundation, that civilization emerged fully formed from scattered hunter-gatherer bands within a few centuries after the world's climate stabilized, So we are left in the space between certainty and speculation, between documented fact and tantalizing possibility. What can we say with confidence? We know the Sumerians possessed genuine knowledge, mathematical, astronomical, metallurgical knowledge that was sophisticated and accurate. We know they attributed this knowledge to the Anunnaki, beings they described as coming from heaven. We know that flood myths are nearly universal across human cultures, often describing world-ending deluges followed by cultural rebirth. We know that approximately 12,000 years ago, the Earth experienced a dramatic climate event, possibly triggered by cosmic impact that would have caused massive flooding and population collapse. And we know that in the immediate aftermath of this event, complex societies began appearing with surprising rapidity, building monuments, practicing agriculture, and developing systems of knowledge that seemed almost too advanced for their supposed stage of development. What we don't know is how to connect these pieces. Were the Anunnaki literal beings or symbolic representations? Was the flood a mythologized memory of the Younger Dryas cataclysm, or simply recurring river disasters amplified by narrative tradition? Did advanced pre-flood civilization exist, or are we projecting modern assumptions onto ambiguous ancient evidence? Perhaps the answer lies not in choosing between these interpretations, but in understanding how oral tradition actually works. For generations, scholars dismissed oral history as unreliable, as myth degrading into distortion over time. But recent research has challenged this assumption. Studies of Aboriginal Australian oral traditions have verified that stories passed down for over 10,000 years accurately preserve information about coastlines that were drowned when sea levels rose at the end of the Ice Age. Stories that describe specific islands, specific landmarks, now underwater, but visible in sonar mapping of the continental shelf. If oral tradition can preserve accurate geographic information for 10,000 years, what else might it preserve? Could the Sumerian tablets, written down around 2600 BCE, be recording stories that originated thousands of years earlier? Stories passed down through generations of survivors who witnessed real events. Not perfectly preserved, certainly embellished and mythologized, but carrying within them a core of historical truth. If so, then perhaps the answer is not history or myth, but both. History wrapped in myth, preserved through mythological narrative, because that was how pre-literate cultures stored and transmitted information. The flood was real. The destruction was real. The knowledge that was lost and partially recovered was real. But the survivors, lacking scientific language, described what they experienced in the terms available to them. Gods, heavens, divine intervention. Not because they were primitive or superstitious, but because they were human, making sense of catastrophe through the narrative structures of their time. And we, living in the 21st century with satellites and DNA sequencing and deep time archaeology, we are still trying to translate their words, still trying to extract the data from the mythology, still trying to answer the question that haunts every ancient text. What actually happened? The Sumerian tablets will not give us certainty. They were never meant to. They are fragments, clay impressions of stories told around fires, recorded by scribes who are themselves working from older sources. But they offer us something perhaps more valuable than certainty. They offer us the challenge, the invitation to look deeper into our past, to question our assumptions about human history, to remain open to the possibility that we have forgotten more than we remember. Because whether the Anunnaki were gods, ancestors, survivors of a lost civilization, or something else entirely, the knowledge they left behind was real. The astronomy was accurate. The mathematics was precise. The descriptions of catastrophic flooding align with geological evidence of real climatic upheaval. And the memory of a world before, a time when knowledge was whole and civilization was given rather than gradually invented, this memory persists, not as proven fact, not as dismissed fantasy, but as something between, a whisper from the antediluvian world, pressed into clay, waiting for us to finally understand what it's trying to say. And perhaps that's why these texts continue to fascinate us. Why, in an age of science and skepticism, we still return to the Eridu Genesis, still pore over translations of the Atrahasis epic, still debate the nature of the Anunnaki, because they challenge the story we tell ourselves about human history. The neat narrative of linear progress, of civilization building slowly from nothing. They suggest instead that history is cyclical, that knowledge can be lost, that we may not be climbing toward enlightenment, but recovering from catastrophe, that our ancestors may have known things we are only now remembering. And if that's true, if the tablets preserve even a fragment of genuine pre-flood memory, then the question becomes urgent. What else did we forget? What other knowledge was lost when the waters rose? And what might we still recover if we're willing to listen to the voices speaking to us from the mud? And so we return to the question that opened this journey. What if the Sumerian texts are telling us what really happened before the flood? Not myth, not metaphor, but memory. Distorted perhaps, fragmented certainly, but memory nonetheless. We have walked through their tablets, traced their king lists, examined their astronomical precision, their mathematical sophistication, their inexplicable metallurgy. We have stood in the ruins of cities buried beneath flood sediment, listened to echoes of the same catastrophic story repeated across every continent, every culture, every isolated civilization that rose from the waters. And still, the question remains unanswered, suspended between what we can prove and what we cannot ignore. The mainstream interpretation is clear. The Sumerian flood narrative is mythology, powerful and profound, but ultimately symbolic. A cultural memory of localized flooding in Mesopotamia, amplified through retelling until it became cosmic in scope. The antediluvian kings with their impossible lifespans are literary devices, their reigns representing entire dynasties compressed into single names. The advanced knowledge, the astronomy, the mathematics. These are the achievements of brilliant minds working over centuries, not the inheritance of a lost world. And the Anunnaki, those radiant beings descending from the heavens, they are gods in the traditional sense, anthropomorphized forces of nature, divine explanations for what ancient people could not yet understand through science. This interpretation is rational, cautious, grounded in what can be measured and verified. And yet, it leaves so much unexplained. Why does Sumerian have no linguistic ancestors? Why do their astronomical records contain multi-generational observations that appear complete from the beginning? Why do cylinder seals depict technology that seems displaced in time? Why does the same flood story, the same narrative of divine punishment, human survival, and world rebirth appear in cultures that supposedly had no contact? Perhaps these are coincidences. Perhaps human psychology simply generates similar myths independently. Or perhaps there is something older at work, a shared inheritance, a collective memory of an event so catastrophic that it rewrote the human story entirely. The archaeological evidence is tantalizing, but inconclusive. We have flood layers, we have submerged ruins, we have out-of-place artifacts and knowledge systems that appear too refined for their context. But we do not have proof of a pre-flood civilization, not yet. What we have instead are anomalies, inconsistencies, fragments that refuse to fit neatly into the accepted timeline. And those fragments ask uncomfortable questions. Questions about what we assume, what we overlook, and what we might be missing because we are looking in the wrong places or asking with the wrong framework. The Sumerians themselves seem to have understood this tension. They did not claim to be the first. They claimed to be the inheritors, the scribes tasked with preserving what had been given, what had survived. Their tablets read not like the work of inventors, but of archivists, carefully recording knowledge they did not fully understand, but knew must not be lost again. Perhaps that is the real message encoded in their flood myths. Not that gods once walked the earth, but that civilization is fragile. That knowledge can be drowned. That everything humanity builds can be erased in a single generation if we fail to remember, fail to preserve, fail to pass it forward. Whether the antediluvian world was a literal advanced civilization, a mythic golden age, or something stranger still, the Sumerian texts force us to confront an unsettling possibility: that our ancestors were not primitive, that their knowledge was not accidental, and that the history we think we know may be only the most recent chapter in a much longer, much stranger story. So what do you think? Are the Sumerian flood texts mythology or memory? Let us know in the comments where you're listening from and what mysteries you want us to explore next. If this journey through the oldest stories ever written has sparked your curiosity, subscribe and join us as we continue venturing into the shadowy corners of history, where documented fact meets tantalizing possibility. Because whether these tablets record literal truth or powerful myth, one thing is certain. The Sumerians looked back across the floodwaters and saw something we have forgotten. And in the wedge-shaped marks they pressed into clay, they left us a message. Not answers, but an invitation. To remember, to question, to wonder what else might be buried beneath the mud, waiting to be found. The mystery endures, and so do we.